Okay, so we have a couple things to finish up from chapter 1 as we begin today and move on into chapter 2, into the 7 letters to the 7 churches. We left off last Thursday by we left off before John's vision. Last thing we heard was a loud voice that John hears, and then he turns to see that voice, and that's where we've picked up. And he's told to write a letter to 7 churches, and so that's where we finished. So John hears this loud voice like a trumpet, and he turns to see what he has heard. This phrase, or this motif of hearing and then turning to see, is one that will appear several times throughout Revelation. And so he turns to see, and as he turns to see, he sees something very interesting. All right, a couple different representations of what John sees. A print from Albert Dürer in the Reformation time period, so the 16th century, a more contemporary expression trying to get across this image of what John sees as he describes it. I think though that a lot of these images still don't reflect very well the text and the experience that John goes through. It's overwhelming. But he turns and sees 7 lampstands. And among the 7 lampstands, he sees one like the Son of Man. Now, in saying one like the Son of Man, using that phrase, what do you immediately think of when you hear that phrase, Son of Man? Right, so the phrase Son of Man was a phrase that appeared quite frequently throughout the Gospels. Both Jesus referring to himself and others using it for him. A messianic term meant to suggest Jesus as the Messiah. And so this is what John turns and sees. I see one like the Son of Man. But it has a deeper import than just the messianic connection with the gospel, and we'll see that in a minute. So what else does John say? Well, he sees him in a long robe, wearing a golden sash. His head and hair are white like wool. His eyes are like fire, and his feet are like bronze. When the one like the Son of Man speaks, it's the voice like the sound of many waters. He has 7 stars in his right hand. There's a 2-edged sword coming out of his mouth, and finally his face is like the sun shining full force. Now, probably most of the pictures that you have seen of Jesus, right, that claim to be of Jesus, don't look like this. I mean, this is not the traditional, especially in the West, the traditional view of what people think Jesus looked like. But in these images and in these things that John sees are some very important aspects. But when you read the description in Revelation chapter 1 of this appearance of Jesus, what's your immediate response? What do you think of when nowhere in the Gospels are we really given a description of what Jesus looked like. So this is the only description of Jesus found in the New Testament, and certainly one we think doesn't accord with how he looked on earth. But when you read this description, what are your responses to it? What do you feel, what do you think when you see this or read this?
Shows the power that he has.
Okay, so it kind of radiates power, right? So Jesus is demonstrating power. What else?
I turned around and saw something like that. I was terrified.
All right, and this it's a very terrifying thing. I mean, just turning around and seeing someone with a sword out of their mouth would be terrifying. Let alone, right, eyes like fire and hair like wool, white like wool. Anything else?
I feel like what John saw here, and throughout most of Revelation, he had a very difficult job of describing what he saw to the people in a way that they would understand it. So a lot of these similes they're helpful in some ways, but I feel like if he was to describe it to us today, he would use a lot of different comparisons just to help us get an idea of what it was like.
Yeah, I mean, he's trying to get it across to his readers what he's experiencing. So he's trying to, connect to things that they would have recognized. Okay, wool and bronze and those kind of things. And you're right. I think today, if it occurred in more modern times, or if he was writing to specifically a modern audience, he would have used different images. And so it's almost as if it's one of those aspects of you can't quite put it into words. And so John's just trying to get across this experience. Now, several of these things, of course, reflect some ideas about what he's communicating. We've already talked about power. We've already talked about the terrifying nature, the fearful nature. We'll talk about the 7 lampstands and the 7 stars here in a minute, but when you read something like he has a 2-edged sword coming out of his mouth, what do you think that's meant to communicate?
His tongue, the power of the tongue.
All right, so the power of the tongue.
The gospel.
The gospel, right? In the book of Hebrews, the Hebrews writer says in chapter 4, verses 12 and 13, that the word of God is living and active and sharper than any 2-edged sword. Right? And so the idea of the tongue has to connect with the word, the message. We'll see later Jesus referred to as the Word of God in chapter 19. Right? And so the sharpness of the message, the judgment, right, that's coming. And one of the things that, back to those pictures, and if you Google Jesus Revelation 1, as I did to try and find pictures, right? There's something about these pictures being lacking, especially this last one. His face was like the sun shining full force. None of them could really capture that, where I felt like, it's just blazing sun. And so there's this kind of the splendor and terrifying brilliance is the way one commentator put it about this, the sun shining full force. But the other thing that's going on here is related to some verses again from the Old Testament. And specifically, there's some things that occur in Daniel chapter 7 that are really interesting in helping us understand this image. So if somebody would turn to Daniel chapter 7 and read verses 9 and 10 and 13 and 14. 9 through 10 and 13 through 14.
I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. His garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, his wheels a burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. A thousand thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were open. You said 13 and 14?
13 and 14.
I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Men coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed.
So in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel has a vision, and there's essentially 2 main characters in this vision. One is the Ancient of Days, and the Ancient of Days is described there in verses 9 and 10. And then there is this one like the Son of Man. Now, looking at Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, and 13 and 14, what has happened in the filtering of Daniel chapter 7 into Revelation chapter 1?
Son of God being dominion over the kingdom.
All right, so there's that aspect of the kingdom. Of course, earlier in Revelation 1, it talks about, we share in the kingdom. What else do you know?
The Son of Man looks a lot more like the Ancient of Days.
Right, the description of the Ancient of Days is essentially a lot of the things that John says about how the one like the Son of Man. So there's this conjoining of the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man. And so not only does this image radiate terror, radiate power, it also radiates that for John, Jesus is the Son of God, right? Jesus is God. Jesus is the Ancient of Days, while he's also the Son of Man. The other passages listed up there, Daniel chapter 10 talks about an angelic messenger coming to Daniel, and his eyes are like fire, his feet are like bronze. And then some of the other passages there talk about a sword coming out of the mouth of God, right? And so those are what those other passages are. And so we presented here with kind of a rather frightening and disturbing image. One that we might not like of Jesus. I mean, we want to have a Jesus that's calm and gentle and loving. And this is a very terrifying, powerful image of Jesus. And, very much appropriate to the purpose of Revelation. Right? Revelation very much about, God exercising his wrath. So we talked about the 7 lampstands, one like the Son of Man. The one like the Son of Man has 7 stars in his right hand. The 7 stars, of course, are the 7 churches that will be addressed. And thinking about this image of 7 stars in his right hand, there are some interesting coins. Yeah, the stars were the angels of the 7 churches. Thank you. And so, but this idea here that is represented in Roman imagery of the stars and the emperor and dominion. So this also reflecting Jesus' divinity. It is a very terrifying image, and one that causes John to essentially pass out, we might say. And so John says, I fell at his feet as though dead. Not necessarily suggesting that John is close to death because of seeing this, but that, it's kind of it's a figure of speech, right? And so he's essentially kind of saying, I passed out. It was like I died, right? And because of that, and because of his response, the one like the Son of Man says, do not be afraid. Here too, interesting, he's overwhelmed by the experience. But if we're right that the author of Revelation is the Apostle John, he spent quite a few years with Jesus. He doesn't have anything to be terrified about Jesus, yet this image, this expression of Jesus, is one that is quite terrifying. Furthermore, after saying, do not be afraid, the one like the Son of Man identifies himself. I am the first and the last. Now, in saying I am the first and the last, what would that connect to that's already been said in Revelation chapter 1? The Alpha and the Omega. Now, eventually in Revelation, Jesus will say, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, and explicitly make that connection. But right now, the readers are drawn back to the statement made in verse 8, when it is God saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega. So throughout this first chapter, it's being emphasized of Jesus being God. Now, why would that be something that John would really try to emphasize? Or that, the Spirit would encourage John to emphasize? In the situation that these 7 churches find themselves in. What are they being pressured to do? Worship the emperor, worship all sorts of non-Christian deities, right? All sorts of gods and goddesses. And so throughout this first chapter, it's emphasized, right? Jesus is God. Jesus is God. Jesus is the only one. The image of the first and the last also found throughout the Old Testament, especially these verses in Isaiah. God several times will say, I am first and the last. But not only is the Son of Man, the one like the Son of Man, the first and the last, he's also the living one. I was dead, And see, I am alive forever and ever, and I have the keys of death and of Hades. Now, specifically what he means here, of course, is the resurrection. He's specifically emphasizing Jesus' resurrection. Right? I was dead, I am alive forever and ever. Not only is Jesus alive forever and ever, he also has the control of death and Hades. Sometimes death and Hades are personified in Revelation, right, talked about as people. Sometimes not. In this case, the personification is not a part of this. Hades, of course, refers to, in the New Testament, the realm of the dead, the companion phrase of Sheol in the Hebrew, but also related, of course, to the Greek god, Hades, who was the ruler of the underworld, the Roman god Pluto. Right? And so the power of death and the power over Hades, the realm of the dead. By saying, of course, he has the keys of death and of Hades, he can open them up and empty them. He has control. So this idea of keys suggests power, control. And of course, in many respects, what's being emphasized here is a key way in which Christianity differed from the Greeks and the Romans over the issue of the afterlife. The Greeks and the Romans believed there was life after death, but it was a one-way street, and it was for disembodied souls. But here, and throughout the New Testament, it's emphasized that the physical body will be brought back to life. The soul will be reanimated in a physical body. An idea that was popular among Jews, well, not really popular, it was peripheral among Jews, but it was something that would take place at the end of time. At the end of time, the righteous would be resurrected. But here we have this claim that someone has come back to life, never to die again, in the middle of history, something unique for Christians. In fact, this contrasts with some markers on tombs in Greek and Roman culture. So there's an epitaph on one Greek tomb that said, after having died, no one comes back to life from here. It was a one-way street. And a lot of the myths that talked about people trying to recover their loved ones from the underworld, from the afterlife, always ended with the failure to do so. In fact, Roman tombs might bear the inscription NFFNSNC, or might actually have it written out. A Latin phrase that essentially said, I was not, I was, I am not, I do not care. So this idea of, I didn't exist, then I was born, I existed, I don't exist anymore, it doesn't matter. Quite different view of the Christian afterlife, which says that, you still exist and will be brought back to bodily form. So the living one. And so John is told again, write what you have seen, what is and what is to take place after this. And then the Son of Man, Jesus, essentially explains to John what the seven stars and the seven lampstands are. The seven lampstands are the seven churches, and the seven stars are the angels of the seven churches. Which leads us now into chapter 2. And